going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings and welcome to the Anadromist. This is Burn Power coming to you on a rainy day in Tbilisi, Georgia. And today what we are going to do is we are going to continue our How We Got Here series, part 10, the Techno-Tween Age, or the late 90s. And I have a very specific reason for calling it the Techno-Tween Age. What we're going to do is we're going to start with a little recap of where we were in the early 90s. If you remember, near the end of my last video, we were dealing with the suicide of Kurt Cobain, and it was my contention that this was a very important event which essentially ended the concept of rock and roll as a real rebellion. Now, this might seem strange given some of the material we're covering today, that I would say it kind of ended then, but hear me out. There is a pattern I've noticed in music history, but also in art and painting, poetry, other forms, where a figure comes along who changes the way things are in the art form. So, in music, it's Beethoven. Things had been going along one way for quite a while, and suddenly Beethoven comes on, and, you know, if you met someone like Bach was essentially a very glorified household servant. He didn't see himself as a capital A artist. But Beethoven comes along, and Beethoven says, I am the new artist. I am the revolutionary man. He even has his Eroica symphony dedicated to Napoleon and the new revolutionary fervor at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. Well, he didn't go on that way, but that's the story of Beethoven. But the point is this, is Beethoven is essentially asserting himself as an artist. If you listen to Bach, and there's lots to listen to, the more you listen to Bach, the harder it gets to find him in his music. That is to say, can you tell what kind of person Bach was at home from listening to his music? Not really. Was he the, dark and brooding toccata and fugue in D minor? No. Was he the, Jesu, joy of man's desiring Bach? Well, maybe a little. Was he the cantatas? Was he the St. Matthew's Passion? He was a happy family guy. He had a lot of children. He wasn't perfect, but the point is this. Listening to Bach's work, what you get is not a simple definition of a man through his work. But listening to Beethoven, suddenly you hear this man who's got all these emotions and power and passion, which is great for being Beethoven. But it sets a new idea in music. The idea of artist as almost like messianic-like figure. So this is the first element in the pattern. The Messiah figure who comes along. You could go back to Leonardo or Michelangelo in art, and and there are other figures in other disciplines that one could go to. But then you get the religion. So Wagner comes along and says that music and the arts are the religious experience. God, no. But but our spiritual capacity for music and art, that's the religion. And so he considers the highest form the one that mixes the most, and in his day, that was opera. I suppose if he'd lived to see cinema, maybe he would have thought that was it. But he essentially makes a religion out of it. The aesthetes at the end of the 19th century lived for art and music, and you can hear it in their music, Debussy or Ravel, and these drifting sonorous pieces. But then you have people who look at this new religion and say, but wait, we're drifting. We're not really doing what the religion says we should do. And these are the prophets. Arnold Schoenberg comes along and he says, no, we have to get back to real music, not this just music as it. We want to express ourselves even better. And so it comes up with something like the 12-tone row, in which all 12 notes in the harmonic series are used, but never repeated, which the more you know about music, the more difficult you know that is to be. Things like rhythm and melody and harmony are seen as almost like, it's garish, it's vulgar, it's just low entertainment. And then you come to, finally, an apocalyptic figure. In music, it would be someone like John Cage, or someone we'll meet later today, Karlheinz Stockhausen. And these figures essentially take noise itself and turn it into music. I find it really fascinating that music, the more you live for it, the more you kill it, which is strange. Because music, you say, yeah, but I love music. And yet we have a tendency to kill the thing we love through possession, through trying to pull it apart and see what makes it work. Well, anyway, the pattern of music, the modern era of music, ends by the 1970s, and with minimalism. And at that point, you start something new, something postmodern. People like Steve Reich and Philip Glass and Lamont Young and John Adams and these other people. So, but then you see, now this took about 150 years or more for this process to work itself out. But then you see the same thing happen in jazz. Louis Armstrong kind of represents the Bach era in jazz. But then you start getting to, you finally get a figure who comes along, and in jazz's case, it's Charlie Parker. And suddenly Charlie Parker's music is Charlie Parker's music. It's it's not just improvisation, it's existential improvisation. People like Miles Davis and Thelonious Monk and these people come along and they're really improvising. The original hipsters, the jazz hipsters who really don't have much connection to people we call hipsters today, and the jazz hipsters and the beats, who would sometimes derided as beatniks, they made a religion of jazz. They would sit and listen. This is where you get the image of the beret and the black glasses and the cigarettes and the coffee shops and stuff like this, listening intently to that next, did you hear what Coltrane did on this one? Well, speaking of Coltrane, you get to a point where the religion needs a prophet. And so people like Ornette Coleman and John Coltrane come along and they bring the new message. They do the same thing that Schoenberg does. They abstract the music. They start to pull it apart. They look for new ways of doing it. And then, finally, in jazz, you come to the apocalypse. And the apocalypse in jazz is people like Albert Ayler and free jazz. And it's just like, is noise jazz. It got to the point when I was working in the record industry that the only way I could tell the difference between a modern classical work of abstraction and a modern jazz work of abstraction was the presence of a bass and drums in some sort of group in the jazz, because sonically there wasn't much different. They had both arrived at the same place. Well, then you have rock and roll. Rock music comes along. And the same process. Interestingly enough, what took 150 or more years in jazz to go from the Messiah to the Apocalypse now takes in, 1945 or so, we'll give roughly for Charlie Parker, to 1970, we'll say roughly for free jazz, although it was a little bit earlier, but we'll give it that. 25 years? It's just like, bam, that just happened. Well, in rock and roll, what do you get? Who's the Messiah figure? Well, it's Bob Dylan, and rock and roll is interesting. It's Bob Dylan through the mouthpiece of the Beatles. That is to say, he influences the Beatles, and they change from being She Loves You, Yeah, Yeah, Yeah to Sgt. Pepper's. In fact, one could almost say, with something like Revolution No. 9 on the White Album, that the Beatles go all the way through the whole process themselves, almost instantly. But I think what you start seeing in rock music is that you start getting the whole genres start becoming the process, the pattern. So Dylan and the Beatles, and then all the people who followed them, Jimi Hendrix, the Doors, Procol Harum, the Moody Blues, all these people were putting out these messianic albums in the late 60s. Then you get to then you start having all these people, the Woodstock generation, all the people who lived for music, who worshipped these, wanted to see them in huge arenas. And then you get the prophets to come along, and the prophets are the punks. They come along and it's just like, no, this stuff has gotten too long, and you're just making those guitar solos go on forever, and it sounds like jazz. And so the punks come along and shake their fist. But finally, in the grunge era, you finally come to the apocalyptic mode. The noise music of Sonic Youth or Band of Susans, the endless drifting noise sounds, some group like Slint. Amazing music, but just this weird drifting noise. So this is the pattern. This Messiah, religion, prophet, apocalypse. Does it sound like anything else to you? Maybe the Christian story? I don't think that's an accident. I think it is, in a sense, a parody almost, but really a religious substitution for the Christian story, because all of these people are within it, in a sense. They are all coming from the remains of Western society, which had been Christendom, for all the problems that entailed, which I'm not going to discuss. But nevertheless, there is this pattern. But the pattern isn't done yet, because now what we're about to see at the end of the 20th century is that the whole pattern essentially is going into popular culture en masse. And you could say that someone like David Bowie or Madonna is a great choice. She's already the messianic figure who is self-conscious, but already playing a game with it, within pop terms. This is not rock music. But it's not just pop music, it's all of culture. I mean, you can look at things like the internet as part of the way we worship this. It's part of our religion of pop culture. You can look at the prophets, Steve Jobs or Bill Gates or even Noam Chomsky, as part of the people who interpret and say, wait a minute, what's going on here? Or you could say that the noise, the apocalyptic noise, I mean, just go to Times Square, go to the internet, the chaos of knowledge and information. It's all there. And I'm not going to go into that thesis too much tonight, but a little bit. One of the other things that's important is that essentially the idea of rock as a revolution is dead. But who won the war? We'll come to them in a moment. Let's start with just going back a little bit. We're going to start a little bit of video from some history of rock and roll that Warner Brothers put out in 1996, I think it was, or 94, 90, I think 95. Which is perfect, because essentially the story was over then. I don't think they realized that. They thought, plenty more is coming. And yeah, certainly more did come, but nothing more of any significance. I mean, it really was over after Kurt Cobain. That is to say, not that people don't make rock music anymore, but the idea that rock could be rebellious was over. So we're going to watch U2 play a little bit. We'll hear Bono from U2 talking.
Not many things travel well around the world because of language. The one thing that travels well is rock and roll.
And in this process, rock goes global.
I remember in the Himalayas, up at Namche Bazaar, which is the last element of civilization really before you enter into Everest Base Camp area, Khumbu Valley. It's up around 16,000 feet. It is the highest point of any civilization. This was the model for Shangri-La, that old ancient movie and stuff. And I remember walking into a little box room, like a little warehouse area where they stored rice and grain. And there was a picture of Duran Duran.
Not only is rock going global, but it is displacing, it is destroying local cultures. You know, I'm living in Tbilisi, Georgia now. Since the arrival of the cell phone, the smartphone in particular, the music, the culture is vanishing. Someone said 10 years ago, you could always hear men singing in the restaurants here. You know, getting together and singing. You don't hear that anymore. You see the children with their smartphones. Well, it's all being replaced by this technological stuff.
You know, I've been to India and seen an Indian rap group rapping about things that are happening in that village.
There are cultures in the world that are disappearing, and to some people it's very important that they be preserved. How does that fit in with a system where in every country of the world now people want to watch MTV and play rock and roll? How are the young people going to realize the value of their own music?
What I'm excited about right now is that rock and roll is at this point of it's mutating. It's turning into something else. In fact, the term rock and roll is probably, it's over. And I'm just excited to be at that point where the ground is giving way. You can really feel it just about to go under our feet, and I just want to let go. I want to go with it.
And Bono wants to just go with it, which is funny because now they're seen as complete has-beens as far as having any cultural relevance. I mean, even the Rolling Stones still have more relevance than U2 does at the moment. And my question is, go with what? Don't you realize what's coming? Don't you realize that it's not going to be this wonderful thing? Someone who really did understand what was happening was David Bowie. David Bowie was always very astute in his observations. Once he got out of his mask-changing persona phase and started to be more himself, although he always did change his fashion style every few years. But still, once he settled down on being David Bowie, he really understood certain things that are coming. Listen to him in this interview from 1999 talking about music and what had happened to rock music.
Did I read somewhere that you said if you were 19 you wouldn't go into the music business?
I think that's probably quite right. I think I'd probably just be a fan and a collector of records.
What would you do?
I wanted to be a musician because it seemed rebellious, it seemed subversive. It felt like one could affect change to a form. It was very hard to hear music when I was younger, you know. When I was really young, you had to tune into AFN radio to hear the American records. There was no MTV, and it wasn't sort of wall-to-wall blanket music. And so therefore it had a kind of a call to arms kind of feeling to it. This is the thing that will change things. This is a dead, dodgy occupation to have. It's still produced signs of horror from people if you said, yeah, I'm in rock and roll. It was, my goodness. Now it's a career opportunity. And the internet is now, carries the flag of being subversive and possibly rebellious and chaotic, nihilistic and... Oh, yes, it is. Forget about the Microsoft element. The monopolies do not have a monopoly, maybe on programs.
What you like about the fact it is the fact that anyone can say anything or do anything.
From my standpoint, from where I am, because of by virtue of the fact that I am a pop singer, and writer. I really embrace the idea that there's a new demystification process going on between the artist and the audience. I think when you look back at, say, this last decade, there hasn't really been one single entity, artist or group, that have personified or become the brand name for the 90s. It was starting to fade a little in the 80s, and in the 70s there were still definite artists, in the 60s there were the Beatles and the Hendrix, and in the 50s there was Presley. Now it's subgroups and genres. It's hip-hop, it's girl power, it's a communal kind of thing. It's about the community. It's becoming more and more about the audience, because the point of having somebody who led the forces has disappeared, because the vocabulary of rock is too well known. It's a currency that is not it's not devoid of meaning anymore, but it's certainly only a conveyor of information now. It's not a conveyor of rebellion.
And so Bowie seems to be putting a lot upon the meaning of the internet. And we'll listen to him talking more about what he's thinking about the internet a little bit later. But it does raise the question, he's talking about the gray area, he does raise this question of what happens when the fans control the art. And I don't think he quite foresaw the tyranny of fandoms, which I covered in my Cargo Cults video. Nick Cave, on the other hand, and you remember Nick Cave from the last couple of episodes where he is just, fingers down the throat of love, but then he starts doing almost like gospel songs, but he still has an edge. But here Nick Cave asks, where is the rebellion in the late 90s? Is there any left?
You have a kind of multicultural event that's designed to open people's eyes up to new sorts of music they wouldn't have heard before and stuff. This is great, and I'm not sure if it's exactly happening that way, and I'm not really sure if this generation's eyes particularly want to be opened up.
It's really the only thing of its kind in the United States, so kids just want to blow off some steam and come to the big rock show.
Youth is all about bonding together in some way and rebelling against the older generations and everything around it. But I just don't see where the rebellion actually is.
Well, of course, Kurt Cobain is dead, Nirvana is over, but all the bands from the time keep going. Nobody just said, okay, we're done. Nevertheless, you get things like, what is it? You get Pearl Jam continues, Soundgarden continues and such. But suddenly, after Nirvana's death, another thing starts to pop out, and that is this kind of teenage rock. And you really feel it. The first real sign of it was the album Dookie by Green Day. They had 2 albums out before that. No one paid them much attention. They were kind of a punky sort of band. But now they're doing this kind of punk pop music. And I think one of the interesting things about it is they're the first band who realizes what they're doing is not teenage rebellion. Which is really funny because it sounds like it, looks like it. But listen to what Billy Joe, the lead singer, says about whether the music is really an alternative or not.
It's like this alternative rock thing, I don't know how many times I've heard that word get thrown around, alternative. It's like alternative to what? The media has really sucked up all of it. It's the main genre of music that people are, it's like that's really popular right now. And when I think of alternative music, I think of like just something different from what's happening in the mainstream, and this is about as mainstream as you can get, not that it's bad.
And let's listen to Green Day play at Woodstock 94, which was a real joke. I mean, this bear no resemblance to Woodstock and would bear an awful lot of resemblance to Lollapalooza, which is what Nick Cave was referring to in the earlier piece we heard. But listen to their songs and notice that, you know, for them, like Nirvana, they're still stupid and contagious. You know, that what they're doing is, as he says, the same old shit, you know. But they're certainly aggressive about what they're doing, but they're not trying to change anything. They're just simply saying, we're stupid teenagers, we're stupid youth. Yeah, he's in his 20s. We're stupid youth. What are you going to do? Might as well just make some noise.
That's Green Day rocking out on the South Stage from earlier today.
I sit around and watch the tube, but nothing's on. I change the channels for an hour or two. Tweet all my thumbs just for a bit. I'm sick of all the same old shit. In the house with unlocked doors and I'm fucking late. When my lips and close my eyes, take me away from heaven. I'm trying to burn you red flags on a slow shit.
After Green Day, the floodgates were open on these new punk pop bands or pop punk bands. Pop punk is better. Groups like Linkin Park or Offspring, and groups related to them, like there was a neo-ska revival, groups like No Doubt, and oddly enough, a neo-swing revival. That came out of nowhere, but not really, because swing music was a very commercial form, very rhythmic. Swing music was to the original jazz of the 1920s what disco music was to like soul music. It was a complete commercialization of it. Not that it wasn't fun, not that disco music doesn't have its moments. But again, what's happened here is that, you know, Cherry Poppin' Daddies, I actually remember seeing them play. I was with a group that was more of a kind of a weird punkish alternative whatever band. We were touring and I was their tour manager. Don't ask. And we showed up in Portland, Oregon, and we got displaced from being the headliners, and they put Cherry Poppin' Daddies on there in 1994. And the kids were all going nuts for this. And you were saying like, oh, I see. But, you know, the truth is after Nirvana, and during the grunge era, everyone had like longer, scruffier hair and such like this. And then I remember one of my friends in a band came home one day and he said, you know, I was at this club, Limelight, and I saw all these kids, bridge and tunnel people, you call them. They all had long hair and they were, you know, just, and he said, I went home and just shaved my hair off. I said, punk revival's starting. And that's what happened. The rest of the 90s was indeed the punk revival. Well, but it was all for kids. It was all this, you know, it was Nirvana was serious. I feel stupid and contagious. There was something real about what Kurt Cobain was singing. But it all became commercialized. So that the rebellion, in a sense, became canned. And the companies had a stake in keeping it that way, keeping it canned, but keeping the rebellion, which would kind of backfire on them eventually here. So one of the people who was most important in the late 90s was the group and also the person, Marilyn Manson. And the interesting thing about him is that he took a lot of the darker elements of extreme culture. You remember me telling you about that, like the photography of Joel Peter Witkin, the strangeness of the performance artists pouring all sorts of fluids over their body, cutting themselves. But he took these and put it into a real saleable package. And he went around, and so all the people, I guess they call his music goth, but it was also kind of industrial, kind of metal, somewhere in the intersection between those three things. And yet it was a very sellable commodity. He was a huge artist at the end of the 90s. And watch this video. This is by, the video itself was directed by Floria Sigismondi, who is an Italian director, a woman who was, this is like cutting edge. If you want to know where was the cutting edge of film in the 1990s, you look at that. You look at this film that's coming up. And this is for a song called The Beautiful People. And it's all relative to the size of your steeple, he says. So we'll talk about this in a minute. Yeah, so he doesn't like the beautiful people. The beautiful people, you get the feeling, are the Hollywood celebrities, the people who go to the nice schools and all this sort of stuff. And yet, if it's the celebrities and Marilyn Manson becomes a celebrity, is he then not one of the beautiful people, even if he's trying to be ugly? Isn't he one of those people? And indeed he was. And I think he was smart enough to know it too. And there was another song later called The Dope Show. We're all in the dope show now. We're essentially all in the show that gives us our fix. And so again, unlike the past, rather than fighting against it, he's simply saying we're all part of this. Now what's funny is, in his live shows and in his music, he rails against authority figures like the churches. He grew up in some sort of Christian background before he rejected it. He rails against the cops. He rails against the government. He rails against schools and education. And what I find really funny about that is he's on the largest record label in the world, the Universal Music Group, that eventually would own almost more than like 60 or 70% of all the music in the world. Never heard him rail against that. So, yeah, what kind of rebellion is this? Well, you know what? It's exactly the kind of rebellion we're going to see when we get to the 21st century. Almost a sponsored rebellion. So he's about to do a piece here called Anti, and he talks about being anti-cop, and notice the way he pauses when he says it, as if to expect, like, yeah. And then, of course, this is after the LA riots, after Ice-T's Cop Killer, and things like that. So that was like a cool thing to say then. He's also anti-white. He certainly wouldn't be the only one in history as we come down to the present. But then he says he's also anti-black. He says he's anti-queer, but he's also, listen to what he's saying. And what he's doing is he's doing something which you can't do now. And that is he's trying to say I'm anti-everything. He's trying to get everybody. He's trying to get under everyone's goat here. But no, in a way, what's interesting about him is in a way he's a precursor to the kind of rebellion we see today.
Anti-choice and anti-girl. I am the anti-flag unfurled. Anti-white and anti-man. I got the anti-future plan. Anti-fascist and anti-mind. I am the anti-music god. Anti-whore. There'll never be enough for anti-more. I can't believe in the things that don't believe in me. It's your turn to see what I hate about me. Anti-money and anti-hate, anti-things I fucked and ate. Anti-cop and anti-fun. Here is my anti-president gun. Anti-Satan and anti-black. The anti-world is on my back. Anti-gay and anti-dope. I am the anti-faggot pope. I can't believe in the things that don't believe in me. Now it's your turn to see what I hate about me.
Thousands of people in that auditorium. And he gets them all to chant with him. And he gets them to chant, "We hate love, we love hate."
We got a new national anthem for Canada. We hate love, we love hate. We hate love.
Well, Marilyn Manson wasn't the only one who lived on this weird intersection of complete self-consciousness and completely despising their own self-consciousness. And one of the people who very much lived in that zone, another extraordinarily popular act at the end of the 1990s, beginning of the aughts, is Eminem, Marshall Mathers, M&M, who would also call himself Slim Shady as his kind of like DJ rap name. White guy from Michigan who essentially is, he's kind of like the urban version of trailer trash. And he knows it. He hangs out with black people. He gets his street cred authentically. And but what's interesting here is listen to him singing. He's always singing about who's the real Slim Shady. Who am I, really?
May I have your attention, please? May I have your attention, please? Will the real Slim Shady please stand up? I repeat, will the real Slim Shady please stand up? We're gonna have a problem here.
Y'all act like you never seen a white person before. Jaws all on the floor like Pam, like Tommy just burst in the door and started whooping her ass worse than before. They first were divorced, sewing her over furniture. It's the return of the... Oh, wait, no, wait, you're kidding. He didn't just say what I think he did he? And Dr. Dre said... Nothing, you idiots. Dr. Dre's dead. He's locked in my basement. Feminist women love Eminem. Chicka, Slim Shady. I'm sick of him. Look at him walking around, grabbing his you-know-what, flipping the you-know-who. Yeah, but he's so cute, though. Yeah,
And just to back up the contention about identity even further, in the next song, he recognizes that he's got all these kids following him. And this is the late 90s. Teens, are just going nuts for people like Marilyn Manson and Eminem and Green Day and Offspring and No Doubt and all these other bands. They're appealing to teens. But listen here. And he keeps saying over and over, do you really want to grow up to be just like me? And the answer to the question should be no. And that's what he's saying. But that's not what anybody who watched him perform would say. They would all say, yeah.
When I dropped the solo hit, it's over with. I bought Cage's tape, opened it, and dubbed over it. I came to the club drunk with a fake ID. Don't you want to grow up to be just like me? I've been with 10 women who got HIV. Now don't you want to grow up to be just like me? I've got genital warts and it burns when I pee. Don't you want to grow up to be just like me? I tie a rope around my and jump from a tree. You probably want to grow up to be just like me.
And one step beyond Eminem, there was a whole kind of weird movement, nu metal it was called. I don't want to spend much time on it, but where you had kind of people at the intersection of metal music and rap music. We won't go too much further into it, except to mention a group who for some reason became strangely prophetic of the 21st century. And that was the Insane Clown Posse, or ICP. And what's really interesting is that they ended up forming a kind of a group of people who would follow them that got called the Juggalos. And again, largely urban and rural, kind of poor white, not exclusively, but kind of a very trash aesthetic, but also always in, and this is the important part, always in clown makeup. Well, let's listen to one of their songs. I've included some of the lyrics so you can follow this. And it ends up being called The Great Malenko, but they'll explain this as we go.
Pumpkin, put some music on. I feel like dancing.
Hold on, sugar, I'm fixing to right now. 3, 6, 4. All right, now come over here, woman. Let's get this shindig started. Woo! Come on, everybody! Yeah! hell is wrong with this juke machine?
Be warned, my children. 6 will visit, followed by the crumbling of time itself. Before the coming of Shangri-La, a dark carnival will sweep across the land as a shadow, plagued with destruction. A parade of freaks, jugglers, and death. This wretched nightmare is led by 6 faces. 3 have come, 3 have gone. The 4th emerges now.
What the hell's going on?
He walks among us as a shadow, void of light, powered by your own darkness, strengthened by your own wickedry. A horrid reflection of your very own deep desires, cast and reflected back upon yourself. Brothers and sisters, the time has come for the Necromaster. The unleashing of the 4th Joker's card. The arrival of the great
Damn thing! Marianne, what in the hell is wrong with this music box?
Don't mind that old thing, honey. It does that all the time.
Grace Malenko. 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 Come one, come all, and witness magic. I introduce to you an occult sorcerer of the ancient craft of necromancy, a caster of mind-bending illusion from the nether void of the Shadow Walkers, excelled from Shangri-La, the great
So one of the strange things that happens is their music, and a lot of the music of this time, was considered to be over the edge by some people. That's because it was. I remember I worked at a radio station in Alaska in the late 1990s, and I got a CD of one of their singles that bragged about having the F word edited out of it 93 times in one song. And this tells you a little bit about what was going on with radio stations. I was always being given, and I also got the non-edited version. It was very strange because the word was just backwards. So every time you hear cuff, cuff, cuff. And you'd hear it over and over in the song. But they weren't the only ones. I mean, endless groups are making these bizarrely, what can I say, the language was just like way over the top on so many levels, whether it was just the imagery they were using, I just can't even get into it except to say it was scatological, it was obscene, it was stupid humor, and at the same time, the radio stations were expected to play this stuff. And it was popular. I mean, you can't listen to, like one of the things I mentioned before was the Parents Advisory label. Well, that just told kids which version to buy. Don't buy the one at Walmart that doesn't have it, which Walmart made them edit it all out. Buy the one that's over at another store, Tower Records or something, that has all of the words edited out, not edited out. And so people like Eminem, all the rap music and stuff, all had tons and tons and tons of pretty foul language. And these guys did too. And some of their imagery, dealt with all sorts of stuff. And they got in trouble. In fact, the day their record was released, that had the Great Malenko, it was their first one on Hollywood Records. Well, Hollywood Records also happened to be owned by the Disney Corporation. And let me play you a little bit of the controversy surrounding that.
Disney, which had spent a reported $1 million to buy the Posse's contract from Jive Records, claimed it only realized at the last moment that the album and a apocalyptic opus called The Great Malenko was filled with very un-Disney-like sentiments. Record store compliance with Disney's recall was spotty, and the album has sold 18,000 copies so far, enough to enter Monday's Billboard Pop chart at number 63. Inevitably, though, Disney's action sparked a flurry of offers from other major labels for the clown's services. Disney would not talk about it, but Chris Connolly tracked down the Insane Clown Posse in Los Angeles this week to get their side of the story, and here it is.
Chris Connolly on the streets of Los Angeles with the Insane Clown Posse, angrily responding to Disney's decision to pull their record from stores nationwide just hours after its release.
Don't let Disney say that it slipped through their fingers, because I handed this album in 6 months ago. 6 months ago! And you know what I'm talking about, Mickey? Got the lyric sheets, looked at them, approved them, put the record out. That's right. Took it off the shelf. Hollywood Records is not the fault here. The entire staff was down with the clown.
Ticket, please, thanks. Walk through the doors into the halls of illusions. Visit yours and see what could've, it should've, it would've been real. But you had to jack the whole deal. Take a walk down the hallway. It's a long way. It takes all day. And when we get to the end, you'll find a chair with straps and chains. We slap you in there, lock you down tight so you can't move a thread, and pull your eyelids up over your head, cause you're about to witness an illusionary dream. It's just too bad it ain't worth seeing.
So do you think your lyrics are offensive?
I can explain every lyric what it is. Everybody that dies on our record, everybody we kill is either a racist, bigot, or there's somebody that beats their wife, or they're a drunk, or something. That's who we kill. We're like vigilante superheroes.
The important thing about ICP was the clown makeup. They were some of the first people noticing the kind of Joker times we were moving into. And we really have moved into Joker times in many ways. The Todd Phillips movie Joker was almost like a prediction of 2020 and beyond, I'm assuming, where you have all these protests and people going crazy, and it just keeps going and going, and no one knows how to stop it. It just goes on. And yet it almost seems like it's not real people really protesting. It's almost like a juvenile version of protests. You can see my video on Joker if you want the full story on that. I did 2 of them, one on Joker and one on Joker as protest symbol. But one of the things that happened was that during this era, it became all about the teens. There was a Village Voice article, which I have tried to find, about the end of Gen X and the beginning of Gen Y, or what they were calling the brat generation. And I really looked for it online and couldn't find it. It was a fascinating article. And this was by 1998. And I was thinking to myself, well, didn't Gen X just come on the scene? But what had happened was, I think the powers that be that sell things to people immediately said, oh, the real money's over here. You know, in the 1970s, who was The Godfather being sold to? Who was Apocalypse Now being sold to? Not teenagers, that's for sure. Who was The Exorcist being sold to? Not teenagers. I mean, they may have seen it, but they'd have to sneak in. It was a hard R rating. You know, even Jaws wasn't slated towards teenagers. Now, in the 1980s, you start getting all these, like, family-friendly films, you know, so you get E.T. and Star Wars and, you know, all the various films that are big-budget blockbusters, the Indiana Jones and whatnot. And even those, you know, the first Indiana Jones films had some edgy bits in them. But then what happened was, a lot, you know, and you had this whole image of the big hair, people with, like, really bad, over-the-top clothing and stuff, Madonna and stuff, and it was all for the teens, or so it seemed. But then what happened was this postmodern alternative grunge aesthetic comes in, this noise aesthetic comes and wipes it all off. Suddenly Michael Jackson is no longer cool, and he really was no longer cool by that time because of the stuff he had gotten himself into. Then you find a lot of that 80s stuff was looked at as a joke. So there needed to be, but the powers that be, both in the music industry and in the video gaming industry and in the television industry and in the movie industry, all looked at this grungy, noisy stuff and then started to say, yeah, not so much that, but that Green Day power punk, pop punk, that whole thing, we can work with that. And essentially what they did was created a new vision for what a teenager is. And it was a very different vision than the 1980s, although connected to it. In a sense, they leapfrog over each other. And so you started getting things like, for instance, consider the movies of the early 90s. Silence of the Lambs. That's an adult movie. It's a good movie. Pulp Fiction. That's certainly a movie for adults. Schindler's List. That wasn't made with children in mind. Even something like Saving Private Ryan, although it's later in the 90s, was made for adults. But then you start getting movies like Toy Story. Well, Toy Story is obviously made for kids. Although what's interesting to me now, looking back, is how many people look back at this as some sort of like absolutely amazing masterpiece of a film. And it's a good film. But it's not a masterpiece, you see, because it's just a film made for kids and happens to be good. But what's happened is our notions of nostalgia have changed, and they got changed during this period. Consider, okay, so Toy Story is made for kids, and a lot of tweens saw it. This is a new word, the tweens. It's a new marketing word. It's like just before pre-adolescence, but one of the reasons they were calling them tweens is because they also realized, for whatever reason, kids were going through their puberty earlier than in earlier generations. I don't know, too much milk and popcorn or something, but the effect of video games maybe. But take the movie Titanic. Who was that made for? Adults? Yeah, a little bit. Teens. It was made for teens. The main two characters are exactly the kind of people teens love. Heartthrob young kids. Which is interesting is because if you go back, I mean, movies in the 1950s were, except for like horror films and science fiction films and maybe Rebel Without a Cause, they weren't made for teens. They were made for adults. Through most of the 60s, with the exception of movies like Mary Poppins and Sound of Music, most movies were made for adults. The 70s, they were made for adults. In the 80s, you start to get this break, but now you have movies that aren't being made for adults at all, but yet they're not being made for little children either. So, for instance, Scream, pretty cool horror film, very postmodern, because all the kids in the movie know exactly the rules of horror films. I Know What You Did Last Summer. Again, the kids know the rules. The kids are in fact, they're both written by the same writer, Kevin Williamson. The Craft. Okay, teen witches. But this isn't like Bewitched, the television series. This isn't one of these cutesy things. It gets kind of horrifying, but at the same time, the witches are seen as being cool teens. Very seductive stuff. So who finally wins the war? The war of rock and roll, the war of the counterculture versus the mainstream culture. In a sense, who wins the modernist battles? Well, it's actually the people who have been all along figuring out ways to sell it back to you. It is the corporations. It is the commercial industry who wins the war. And what they managed to do, I remember walking into a museum show in New York City in 1989 of all the Sex Pistols memorabilia, all the poster art and such, and I looked at this and I just said, it's a small museum today, it'll be in a big museum eventually, which it was. And I just said, it's over. Because if the museums can make a show out of it, it's just a hop, skip, and a jump from them. You know, I remember once hearing death metal being used to sell Monday Night Football, because, you know, you have these like guys running around and knocking each other, and then you have these like super huge power chords and dense distortion and stuff. And I said, okay, they figured that out. There, what was 1996 Olympics? You have an Iggy Pop song being used to sell Nikes. You know, I'm a street walking Cheeto with a heart full of napalm. Somehow that ends up as a Nike's commercial. And all of it, eventually they figure out how to sell it back to you. And back to you in new configurations that make you want the stuff, the images, the coolness factor over the meaning of it. So people have grown up since the 90s, essentially living in a world where all of this is just really groovy swag. You know, and it is. You can collect Blu-rays, and, you know, there's whole videos of people just showing off their Blu-ray collections, or showing you, like, it's really funny to me because I've collected records for so long. People showing off their record collections, and you realize they don't own a record vinyl recording before the year 2000. You know, and they're so proud of their 25 records that are all like in perfect shape. It's like they own the treasures of Tutankhamun. You know, it's like, and here's this, and they open it really carefully and stuff. And I go like, why do they buy these? Do they listen? I hope so. I mean, the same thing happened with comic books. You know, people buy these Mylar snugs and stuff. So after a while, the joy of everything gets taken out by people who don't collect to understand, but collect to have a cool looking collection, which, you know, I have a very big library. It's not about being cool at all. It's about understanding. If I have anything to give you, it's because of that library. And, well, not just the library, but me interacting with it, and me interacting with movies and music and all of this. That's the point. The point isn't to have cool stuff. The point is to, I must say, it's nice to have interesting stuff. Don't get me wrong. But that's not the point of it. The point is to have things that you can give to others. That, you know, because, hey, I'm not going to live forever. You're not going to live forever. So, but at the same time, we need stuff as opposed to the digital substitutes. That's a whole other story. And I've mentioned it a little bit some other places. But who wins the war? Well, near the end of, in 1999, near the end of the 20th century, an artist comes out who essentially will be the prophetess of the next decade's music. And let me play you a bit of her music for you. Who wins the war? The commercial industries. It's amazing how many people came out of the Disney industry, including Britney Spears and Miley Cyrus and such. It's just amazing. And what they've done is reconstructed what it means to be a teenager. And when you see a song like this with Britney Spears, you're seeing the new definition of being a teenager, a definition which will indeed eventually go throughout the younger grades. What's interesting about this time is that it was the brat generation. It was the first time the millennials began to be heard. But they're being heard not for their own voice, but for the voice that was given to them by the large corporations. So when they look back at that time, they go like, oh yeah, Green Day, oh yeah, no doubt, oh yeah, I still know what you did last summer, oh yeah, Scream 3, oh yeah. They get all these warm gushies about corporate ephemera. You could say, well, yeah, wasn't there a lot of that in different times? It's not the same, though. It's like another level where the corporations now are so cynical about what they're doing that they just simply saying, okay, let's take a young guy like Eminem and make some money off him. They've always been doing that, but now the artists are in complicity with them to a much greater degree. And let's listen to this one girl talking about what it was like being a teenager back in the 1990s, the late 90s.
It was way more relaxed than it is now. Nobody cared where you were. I mean, there were closed halls, but you didn't swipe in anywhere. It wasn't a big deal. You could just go meet with the teacher or go sit in the library or whatever. I mean, we had open campus. We could leave. Senior year, my friends and I would leave every day during lunch.
She's talking about there being no rules and things were more relaxed. It's a bit like people in the 1970s talking about how there were no sexual rules. It was a great time. And then not mentioning AIDS at the end. It's a bit like, well, what it is she's saying, yeah, there were no rules then. Things were great. They started putting out these books about what was happening to not just teenagers, but the tweens. They started having these, they started realizing how young people were now having sex. They were having sex in middle school. It was like, although it wasn't sex because the president said it was, Bill Clinton, and what is and isn't sex. It was a weird time. And one of the reasons why people often say, what about all the helicopter parenting and the snowplow parenting of the next couple of decades? Well, I'll tell you where it came from. It came from them being scared to death over what was happening at the end of the 90s and beginning of the aughts. And because really, as that girl said, yeah, it was more relaxed. And no one had any idea what the kids were getting up to. And their music, their culture, everything was telling them to just kind of be crazy. And so in the end, they end up... there's books like this one, Tribe Apart. I read this book, a very interesting one. Also, Odd Girl Out. These two books both dealt with some of the serious problems that were starting to manifest. In Tribe Apart, she details all of the weird sexual stuff kids are getting involved in. Drugs, of course, but it's just that there is a sense of total disconnection, not just from the boomers, but from Gen X as well. It's almost like every 5 years, with a year on either side, there's a new generation because of the it almost goes with 4 years in high school. So it's very strange. And of course, this is totally being planned for people. They don't realize it, but hey, the new thing is coming out. You need to get into it. So suddenly all the kids now had short hair. All the guys had their head shaved. Girls had a certain look. And again, it's all being marketed from outside, and things are moving faster. And that leads us to the thing that the late 90s will probably always be known for. Finally, the internet, which had been bubbling under in universities and in certain occupations, in the late 90s finally became popular and global. And it's hard to overstate the effect of this. And at the time, it seemed overwhelming. And now when we look back at the late 90s in terms of internet culture, oh, it just seems so cute and small.
As we approach the 21st century, a new means of communication is emerging. This technology uses computer networks to link people on every continent. If we are destined to live in a global village, one day we will all be connected to the internet.
Okay, some people describe the internet as the prototype for the information superhighway, but I just don't get it. You know, this information superhighway stuff sounds like a lot of super hype to me.
Well, of course it is. But the internet does represent a new form of communication, and this is the best part. You don't have to be a computer geek to take a spin on it.
Hey, watch it, John. Some of my best friends are geeks.
Students at Rice can easily reach the internet through a campus-wide computer network. For example, they can search for books in this library without even leaving their dorm rooms. Furthermore, Rice has created a regional computer network that allows computers here on campus to reach the rest of the internet and vice versa.
Now, maybe you've read or heard about the internet, but you're still not exactly sure what it is. Well, if that's the case, don't worry. In no time at all, you'll be able to impress everyone with your amazing techno savvy. The first thing you need to understand is what a computer network is. And that is simply a bunch of computers linked together so they can communicate and share information. The internet, on the other hand, is a collection of computer networks on a local, regional, national, and even international level. Put simply, the internet is just a network of networks.
Simple the internet isn't, but using it can be rather easy. In some ways, it's a lot like your car. You don't have to know how every single part works in order to drive to some wonderful places. All you need to use the internet are
a computer and a network connection. That connection could simply be a phone line and a modem like this one.
Like, a lot of people had an internet connection at home, but it was dial-up. You had to use your phone line at your house to get on the internet. So that means nobody else could be on the phone. And if a phone call came into your house while you were on the internet, it hung up the internet. But people didn't have cell phones. We passed notes a lot. There were all different ways to fold the notes, and you used like fun pens and stuff. I had like a little group of friends. There were 5 of us, and we had a notebook. We called it the notebook. We had code names for each other and for like all of our other friends and guys we liked. We just like write notes to each other, like, here's what's happening with me. There just wasn't the sort of immediate kind of communication that you guys have.
Let's listen to Steve Jobs talking about the meaning and possibilities of the internet.
Well, you know, I think the internet and the web, there are 2 exciting things happening in software and in computing today. I think one is objects, but the other one is the web. The web is incredibly exciting because it is the fulfillment of a lot of our dreams that the computer would ultimately not be primarily a device for computation, but metamorphosize into a device for communication. And with the web, that's finally happening. And secondly, it's exciting because Microsoft doesn't own it, and therefore there's a tremendous amount of innovation happening. So I think that the web is going to be profound in what it does to our society. As you know, about 15% of the goods and services in the US are sold via catalogs or over the television. All that's going to go on the web and more. Billions and billions, soon tens of billions of dollars worth of goods and services are going to be sold on the web. If you could, a way to think about it is the ultimate direct-to-customer distribution channel. Another way to think about it is the smallest company in the world can look as large as the largest company in the world on the web. So I guess I think the web, as we look back 10 years from now, the web is going to be the defining technology, the defining social, the
the defining social moment for computing. And I think it's going to be huge. I think it's breathed a whole new generation of life into personal computing. And I think it's going to be huge. Yeah.
Steve Jobs became like this almost worshipped icon of a figure because of things like, and it was a good thing, the design factor of stuff like the iMac, or later the iPods, and then the iPhone. You know, these designs were much better than the standard white computer frame, but still, it was something that was also, they were designing into it kind of an addictive quality. Here's an interview with Bill Gates and David Letterman. And what I want you to notice here is Bill Gates is talking about this wild stuff that's going to be coming, stuff that is totally everyday stuff to us today. And David Letterman is absolutely mocking him. Like he says, you know, like, yes, and then this thing is going to record it and you can listen to it over again. And he goes like, don't we already have, audio tape? And the audience is totally on David Letterman's side, but Bill Gates is going to win. This idea of the internet is going around. It's not just your little computer, but you're going to connect to the world. But that's not all it's cracked up to be. And one of the most trenchant critics of the new internet world, who saw what it was going to become, and it was going to become basically about selling you stuff, was Noam Chomsky.
Bill Gates, who was typical parasite, kind of watching on the outside, absolutely no interest, now wants to take over the internet and is heading to do it. And private power is not being secret about what they intend to do. What they want to do is take this system developed at public expense, initiative, ideas, technology, and so on, and use it for two purposes. One purpose is for what's called an intranet, that is to carve out big pieces of it, which are simply used for purposes of corporate transactions. So if General Electric wants to have, interactions between its office and, New York and Zurich or wherever they are, Penang and so on, they'll have this closed system with firewalls so you can't break into it, and that'll just be for them, and similarly for other big corporations, other major private tyrannies. So that'll be a large part of the public system, and the rest of it is supposed to be used as kind of like a home marketing service to try to turn people into passive consumers, you in the tube, that's the social unit on which society is constructed. So you don't have to worry about interacting, thinking people doing really bad things like those folks in the slums of Port-au-Prince a couple of years ago. But the people will be passive and obedient and hooked on consuming for themselves, not caring about anyone else. And then you really won't have to worry much about the threat of democracy, which that's the idea. Meanwhile, massive propaganda in the ideological institutions teaches you all sorts of mantras and so on and so forth. Now, that's pretty much the way the story works, I think, at any point where you look at it in detail.
But I always have a problem with Noam Chomsky. And one of my problems is that I think he's right, but he's also just got this narrow focus. He often talks, for instance, about propaganda, and yet it never includes what I would consider himself and his side in it. I think maybe more recently he's learned to include more of what he's doing in it as a result of the fact that many of the people who were following his ideas have now turned against him because he didn't go with the new gender race ideas, which have suddenly mushroomed everywhere. One of the people who really did see what the internet was going to be was David Bowie. I played you part of this 1999 interview earlier, but in this, I think you can really get a sense. He realizes it's not going to be just simply a new way to shop from home or new way to connect with friends, but it's going to radically alter our lives. And this is the takeaway. This is what leads to today. This radical altering of our lives by technology. And in fact, everything in this has to do with technology.
So from my standpoint, being an artist, I like to see what the new construction is between artist and audience. There is a breakdown. There's a personified, I think, by the rave culture of the last few years, where the audience is at least as important as whoever is playing at the rave. It's almost like the artist is to accompany the audience and what the audience are doing. And that feeling is very much permeating music and permeating the internet.
But what is it specifically about the internet? I mean, anybody can say anything. And it all adds up to what? I mean, it seems to me there's nothing cohesive about it in the way that there was something cohesive about the youth revolution in music.
Oh, but absolutely. And because I think that we, at the time, up until at least the mid-70s, really felt that we were still living under the, in the guise of a single and absolute created society, where there were known truths and known lies, and there was no kind of duplicity or pluralism about the things that we believed in. That started to break down rapidly in the 70s, and the idea of a duality in the way that we live. There are always 2, 3, 4, 5 sides to every question. That the singularity disappeared, and that, I believe, has produced such a medium as the internet, which absolutely establishes and shows us that we are living in total fragmentation.
You don't think that some of the claims being made for it are hugely exaggerated? I mean, when the telephone was invented, people made amazing claims for it.
I know, the president,
for example.
The president at the time, when it was first invented, he was outrageous. He said he foresaw the day in the future when every town in America would have a telephone. Now how dare he claim like that? Absolute bullshit. No, you see, I don't agree. I think the internet, I don't think we've even seen the tip of the iceberg. I think the potential of what the internet is going to do to society, both good and bad, is unimaginable. I think we're actually on the cusp of something exhilarating and terrifying.
It's just a tool, though, isn't it?
No, it's not. No. No, it's an alien life form.
What do you think, I mean, when you think then about the
future... Is there life on Mars? Yes, it's just landed here.
But it's simply a different delivery system there. You're arguing about something more profound.
Oh, yeah, I'm talking about the actual context, and the state of content is going to be so different to anything that we can really envisage at the moment, where the interplay between the user and the provider will be so in simpatico. It's going to crush our ideas of what mediums are all about. But it's happening in every form. It's happening in visual art. The breakthroughs at the early part of the century with people like Duchamp, who were so prescient in what they were doing and putting down. The idea that the piece of work is not finished until the audience come to it and add their own interpretation, and what the piece of art is about is the grey space in the middle. That grey space in the middle is what the 21st century is going to be about.
Jacques Ellul, in his book, The Empire of Nonsense. It's a difficult book to read. It's his book about art. But basically he says that essentially by the midway point of the 20th century, all of our artistic and entertainment experiences have been contained within technology as an environment. And I don't think you would be at all shocked to see video games come along. Video games, as it's interesting, being a person who is also a puppeteer, I see video games as essentially the antithesis of puppetry. Because in puppetry, you control figures to perform for someone else. But in video games, you are controlled by the patterns of the technological game, so that you have to do what it says for you to do. You cannot escape that structure. And so you are forced to shoot really rapidly in first-person shooter games. You are forced, there's a lot of games today where you have to, they say the game is free, But then if you want to get extra points, or if you want to, get into certain things, or if you want to get extra power packs, or if you want to get, then you pay more money for these things. And that's where they get you. I mean, these things are totally designed to be addictive. But in the 90s, though, they were quite, when you look at some of the graphics here, you see that they were very much primitive. They were not where we are at all today. Some of them they were just starting to get into 3D molding and such. But if you compare these games to something like this year's Last of Us Part 2, that almost feels like you're watching a movie, except you're controlling the characters, except you're controlled. And that's the thing. The video games are more about controlling your experience. People will often talk about great gameplay and stuff, and I believe you can have great games. And I think there are interesting stories. Have video games ever reached the level of art? Well, not that I've seen. And one of the big problems is that there's always the element of competition. And to me, there is an artistic quality to video games because all things constructed by human beings have an art to them. But at the same time, one would never talk about baseball as an art. You could say, Willie Mays was skilled in the art of baseball. But we know we're not talking about the same thing as writing a symphony or painting a painting. It's a different order of experience. And I think video games seem to be heading more towards e-games, things like that. Well, anyway, the 1990s is the point at which there's a tipping point. Suddenly, most kids' experience of games has moved into the technological realm. Not only video games, but television has become more like that for children. It's the late 90s where you really get the anime that's been creeping slowly across the ocean from Japan finally comes here, and you have things like Dragon Ball Z, which become kids' fare, except it's not that simple. It's not just kids' fare. I think Dragon Ball Z is probably, a great story. But at the same time, if you look at the art and you say to yourself, okay, you've got the big eyes, you've got the really simplistic imagery, and yet you've got these strangely complex stories. And there's a tension there, which I talk about in the Cargo Cult video. This whole thing, well, at some point I plan on doing a video called the Creepy and the Cute, actually a series of maybe 3 videos on the Creepy and the Cute. And to discuss they're new categories. The big eyes, people who think cute things have been around forever really don't know history very well. Likewise, the creepy things haven't been around that long either, believe it or not. But anyway, anime, it's a technological thing. It's often technological in subject matter as well. It's the end of the 90s is a technological time. And what it is it's the victory, in one sense, of a commercialized form of modernism. So if we start thinking about the rave culture, raves are dances. Interestingly enough, many of the people doing the DJs and such doing the raves are aware that there's a tension in what they're doing. They want to give an experience better than the experience that people are expecting. And we'll mention this in a minute. But one of the important things is the connection between that apocalyptic mode in classical music through people like Karlheinz Stockhausen and the new arts of like turntablism, where, and turntablism could be defined as the guy who's on what we call the wheels of steel, mixing the records, using the records as actual found material. Let's watch a bit of a documentary about that, then we'll go into talking more about rave culture.
I color the silences in different layers, so that, for example, there's a silence, and then I take off one of the silent layers, and I hear another silent layer. And then I take that second one and I hear a third silent layer, because there is no absolute silence in the world. And I'm still trying to expand this relation between nothing and something. Very early, I thought that a microphone is a musical instrument, like a bow or like a percussion instrument, whatever you use. And I use a huge Chinese gong with all kind of materials: rubber, wood, metal, glass. And the rhythm, for example, yan dan 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 dan, yeah, making such movements with the microphone over the surface of the tam-tam. And all the movements are notated as the actions to bring the tam-tams into vibrations.
Stockhausen was very important for all the young generation at the moment, and most of them don't even know why. You see, what he has done is not, I'm not now speaking in terms of his outstanding quality as a composer. He had so many practical things done and invented, where, like the dub mixer, he was the first dub mixer in the world. He made it in the 60s, where he was, where he had
in the late 50s already. Yeah.
Yeah, he was a dub mixer. All these practical things, what he has done, and it's showing the way, you can say, for the next 50 years at least.
I would say Stockhausen is the closest to what hip hop, in its true form, what Stockhausen was doing, because that whole idea of, hey, this is what it is, and we can do something with this and shape it and form it and translate it into a form of expression.
So the 90s was the period where raves really started to take off. And I think more in Europe and some other parts of the world than in America, although eventually it was certainly in America as well. But Western and Eastern Europe really got into raves. What I find interesting is that, I'm in Tbilisi, Georgia now, and there's definitely an electronic music culture here. And for the life of me, I've heard quite a bit of it. They often play it on the streets here. Every now and then I'll hear something that really perks my ears up because they're doing something different. But so much of it, I just go like, yeah, they did that already. They did that. They did that. They did that. Because it's essentially, the main point is that you have essentially a beat and a bass. And these are the main things keeping everything going. And it really hardly matters what else is happening. Now, it does matter. And in a way, but what matters is the experience of being at the rave. Of course, there are drugs like ecstasy, Molly, which go with the experience. And, they used to talk about smart drugs and smart water and stuff like this that you would drink. So that you drink water that had lots of vitamins in it and such, sugared water that had lots of vitamins. And they sold this for a while in America. But the reason is because you're dancing all night, and it's coming out of a situation where your body's just depleted, needs some electrolytes and such like that. Where did this culture come from? Well, it came from the distance between disco music from the late 1970s through various types of what they would call house music into eventually turning into what was called techno. But techno, all of this is one species of electronica. And so we're going to watch a little bit of material here about the origins of the techno scene, starting in Germany and America.
And this idea that you created the seamless flow of music that ran all night, created by a DJ, that came from disco, and that has been one of the most radical changes of music in the last 30 years. Giorgio Moroder did an incredible thing. He was one of the most important influences on disco.
I want to do a kind of a futuristic record with Donna Summer, and I said, why don't I do it with the new Moogs or whatever that we had at that time, and that was the song I Feel Love.
Which was created almost entirely on the Moog synthesizer.
I think the only non-synthesizers was the bass drum.
Really launched that whole area of sequenced high-energy disco.
Disco dancing here. Look at the Donna Summer, like Love You Baby. I mean, that first hit, it has her on the audio track, like, you know, basically having an orgasm.
I must say that at the beginning we used the synthesizer a little bit too much as a gimmick, like whack, whack, all those interesting but I guess kind of boring sounds. And while lately the synthesizer became more like an instrument than a sound effect machine.
At the beginning, I think everybody outside of the electronic music field thought that synthesizers were supposed to imitate traditional instruments, whereas the people who were inside electronic music wanted to use synthesizers to make completely new sounds.
What's happened is now we're expecting the disco area for what it stood for, because most of the records that are very popular on predominant right now are disco. It's disco cut-ups of very famous riffs of a lot of disco music which was popular in the 70s. So everything's gone around full circle. It's incredible.
And one of the things that strikes me as I've been to a couple of rave type experiences in New York. They always bored me to tears because I could see that it was an empty experience. A dance should be a celebration, but this wasn't a celebration. It was simply a going through this moment. It was what Walker Percy said, you know, almost every modern gathering is a failed celebration, you know. And you watch people moving, and when you just abstract what they're doing, they're not doing something like, you know, when I watch or have participated in real dances where people have to know steps and such, where there's a bit of etiquette involved, and I compare it to the kinds of movements I see on the dance floors. The kinds of movements I see on the dance floors almost look, what's the word, spastic? They look like there's something wrong with the person. They're just simply moving because the music in these environments, unfortunately I can't play it for you loud enough, but if you've ever been to one of these, you know what I'm talking about. The music is so loud, it goes right through you. You almost feel like you have to move. I mean, I've heard extremely loud electronic music here on the streets they had it last year during the Christmas season, which made me insane. I did a whole video on my biggest culture shock here, and this was having a street festival with electronic music during Christmas time would have to be pretty high. And but I'm sure that's not unique around the world, that there are plenty of places where these kinds of things happen. And but you know, you feel like moving with it simply because the music is going through you and hitting your heart. It's hitting your whole body with literal physical force. Interestingly enough, there's a sense of dislocation to all of this. And one of the more interesting of the turntablist DJs in New York City, DJ Spooky, talked about what he called the culture of amnesia. Give him a listen.
Culture of amnesia. How do you get people to create their culture? Well, you pull away all sorts of memory and see what happens, which is kind of what has occurred with this late 20th century generation. Most people really just don't want to think about historic references. They don't want to think about their engagement in the world around them. It's much easier to be a passive consumer and wear the right Nike shoes or something. I don't know what. It's just, but it's also an internal colonized situation, mentally speaking, for a whole generation.
I totally agree with DJ Spooky. I actually met DJ Spooky. We were both being driven out to WFMU's headquarters in East Orange, New Jersey, in, 1995 or so, and to be potential radio DJs. I eventually got a late night gig there from 3 in the morning till 6 on Saturday nights, and I would play everything from hardcore punk to Arvo Pärt. I just, depending. I would often start off the show one way and end another way, because I was kind of a crazy DJ that way. And eventually I brought that with me to Alaska. Long story.
I keep finding these raves lately, especially the bigger, I'm talking about big commercial raves. Now if I get offered a gig, I'll kind of try and find out what it's all about, what the motivation behind throwing the party is. Because quite often, these things are just about money.
Well, it's different from what it used to be. It used to be people coming together to share like what they had, their uniqueness, and now it's about it's about nothing what it used to be. No, the prices are getting way too high. Wait, how much was $15 used to be expensive for a party? Yeah, no. $30. This was $30. $30.
In Germany, there was another thing that got started. It was called the Love Parade, which was like a techno parade on the streets, an electronic music parade, EDM, electronic dance music. They keep coming up with new names for it. You can never be cool enough for these people, which is fine. I don't care about being cool whatsoever, so I'll call it techno, electronica, EDM, there's all sorts of different, drum and bass, ambient, all these different names for all the different styles. I forbear to list them because it's ridiculous for me to even try. But the Love Parade was this very openly, it's almost like having the Love Parade was basically another gay pride parade with electronic music on the streets. And this went on for years in Berlin and got to have millions of people attached to it. And eventually it just got too much and the whole thing had to stop, which I didn't lose any sleep over. But let's watch a little bit about that. And then we're going to meet a guy named Alec Empire from Germany. And I'm going to stop and talk there for a few minutes.
In the beginning, it started in some really small places in the German techno scene, I would say, mostly in Berlin and in Frankfurt. The next thing was like these East Berlin parties in the big venues. And then we had like this explosion of energy. And I always call it the liberation dance of the East Germans. This effect of these people suddenly, screaming, throwing their hands up, throwing themselves on the floor, getting up, jumping about. And that really made Berlin techno. The love rate started even before the wall came down, 89. The 91 love rate, I think, was the first where people from all over Germany, from east and west, party together. Been 80 years now, and we remember the first one with 150 people, and now it was 1.5 million. That's quite an incredible explosion.
At the end of the day, it's all about like a stupid party, and you see that this has nothing achieved. Everyone who says it's this new generation, everyone is happy about new technology, I mean, that's so naive and stupid. So I think it was boredom that led to fascism in the 20s in Germany, and not hate. And this is exactly what's going on at the moment in this society. Everyone is so bored that no one wants to change anything.
I would die for peanut butter.
Start the Riot. That was actually the music that Alec Empire and his group Atari Teenage Riot was responsible for. And this came into the radio station in Alaska where I was, near the end of the 20th century. And I listened to it and I said, no, I'm taking this home as an example of what has been happening at the end of the 20th century. And I am not letting any DJs play this because it's just, I don't need kids who are at all behind whatever this is doing. It's just too much tension. They're actually using things like punk rock as their samples. They are mixing rap and techno and industrial and hardcore punk. It's just in this one unholy mixture. There were other extreme things near the end like this. The extreme culture didn't go away. It kept bubbling away, creating things. There was one group who I will not mention their name so you don't go look for them. A group of women who performed in England in a rock ensemble. But they would also do videos of actual sex acts in the forest. And they would do sexual acts on stage. I mean, I'm not talking, slightly over the edge here. I'm talking full-blown insertion and such. It continued. It was almost like there were these people who said, we're going to break down the walls. We're going to finally do it. We're going to crush all these bourgeois lowlifes who have, swallowed up culture. We're going to define the new culture. Well, in this next song by Atari Teenage Riot, I'll play you a piece of. It's the name of the song is politely called "Destroy 2,000 Years of Culture," and that's the lyrics that go on and on. But here's what I want you to realize: on the back of the CD that I got, it talked about noise is the key. They understood exactly what I understood about us coming to a culture of noise. They wanted it. They wanted pure noise because to them that noise represents destruction of society. It is about destruction. And destroy 2,000 years of culture. Well, why 2,000? Because that's from the beginning of Christianity. In other words, erase all of this Western civilization, erase it all. And what's interesting is here's the funny thing. Well, it's not funny, ha-ha. It's funny like in weird. They're saying their lyrics are about destroying culture and stuff. And you could put them side by side with quotes from Mein Kampf, where Hitler says things like, all these things that are so rotten and old, all I need to do is kick them over and they will fall apart. He talks about destroying the past, destroying the culture, exactly in the same way. He talks, essentially, there was an element of fascism that grew out of the desire for machine noise. And these people don't realize it. They're so ignorant. They think, and they actually, while they're talking about the glory of noise and such, they actually are essentially dipping exactly into the same Marinetti's fascist manifesto, futurist manifesto, which essentially is a fascist manifesto from 1911. And what they're saying is, they're saying if we destroy and level everything, we can build anew, as if anything new will ever come. You have to have something to build upon. The whole goal of modernism was to rip everything down and then reconstruct in our own image. In other words, to play God. Well, what these people also did was they had a whole thing about how racist, you heard him talking, how racist everyone was. And so what they were going to do is they were anti-fascist. And what they didn't realize was that they were anti-fascist. Well, they're really fascist, disguised as anti-fascist. And you know what? I looked at that and I said, this is what I don't want to spread. And guess what? That group didn't go anywhere, but those ideas did. And they came back with a vengeance through the kind of rioting we saw this year, which were essentially anti-fascist fascists who are so ignorant of the past, they don't realize they've stumbled straight into the power philosophies of essentially the Roman era. And they just don't even understand it. Destroy 2,000 years of culture, please.
It's a dead world, and it's about that time to clear things here. One generation follows another, but something in my head says, keep going, don't give up. Cold sweat running down my back, I don't feel the chaos. The reason to fight is not making a stronger man, cause they don't understand. I won't come down, I won't come down. What am I supposed to do? I try to realize that the time is running out. How? We're on the move. Who's this? What? Why? Cause it takes two. Their money is full of blood, and I know it's for sure. You're gonna take over, radical, terrorize, and I'm not gonna tell you lies. Our chances are low, many problems we got. Fuck the police, blow them out. Destroy 2,000 years of culture. 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 Destroy 2,000 years of culture.
So we've arrived at the Fin De Siécle. French word for the end of the century, but I like the French word. That was what the end of the 19th century was called. And there was starting to be a different vibe that was showing up. For instance, in movies in the year 1999 alone, you had some very interesting things show up. Ringu, which would later be remade in America as The Ring, very much a harbinger of things to come in terms of horror. It was the first of the what would be called J-horror, Japanese horror. Also that year, Audition, The Audition came out, and that is you can barely survive that one if you think it's a love story that, shall we say, goes radically wrong. If you've ever seen the movie, you will be laughing to yourself right now. Blair Witch Project, the first film that was seriously found footage film. And this would become a big genre later in the aughts. And it was also a very scary kind of witch film and such. And that would show up more later in the teens. And then you had Fight Club. And Fight Club was a film that at the time, a lot of people got something out of it, guys in particular. And now as we look back, again, it has this almost prophetic quality. In fact, let's listen to Tyler Durden's philosophy of life.
Do you know what a duvet is? Comforter. It's a blanket. Just a blanket. Now, why do guys like you and I know what a duvet is? Is this essential to our survival? In the hunter-gatherer sense of the word? No. What are we then?
Consumers.
Right. We are consumers. We are byproducts of a lifestyle obsession. Murder, crime, poverty, these things don't concern me. What concerns me are celebrity magazines, television with 500 channels, some guy's name on my underwear, Rogaine, Viagra, Olestra.
Martha Stewart.
Fuck Martha Stewart. Martha's polishing the brass on the Titanic. It's all going down, man. So fuck off with your sofa units and string green stripe patterns. I say never be complete. I say stop being perfect. I say let's evolve. Let the chips fall where they may. That's me, and I could be wrong. Maybe it's a terrible tragedy.
Yeah, there's a darkness there. It's almost like the need to regress into these violent beings because our life has become we've become like consumer sheep. And that tension, and also the mention of white guys in there isn't an accident either. This is a David Fincher film, and I'm pretty sure David Fincher realized that essentially, many of the white males in American society, at least, have been, well, let's put it to you this way. We have castrated the geldings and bid them be fruitful. They are no longer men as they used to be defined as men. Which then brings us to the kind of anger that leads to the Oklahoma bombing in 1995.
The chaos in downtown Oklahoma City did indeed resemble Beirut after what police believe to be a 1,200-pound car bomb ripped through the 9-story federal building shortly after 9 o'clock this morning. More than 500 people were already in their offices, and at least 50 children were in a daycare center on the second floor.
The bombing in Oklahoma City was an attack on innocent children and defenseless citizens. It was an act of cowardice, and it was evil. The United States will not tolerate it, and I will not allow the people of this country to be intimidated.
2 suspects now have been identified, known only as John Doe. They're both about 5'10" to 5'11", about 180 pounds, both with brown hair, one with a crew cut, the other with a tattoo. Those sketches were released as rescue workers worked their way through the wreckage of the Murrah Federal Building, looking for survivors among the close to 200 people believed to be still in that rubble.
Authorities now believe the truck that bore the bomb was parked in a space alongside the federal building. A second vehicle may have been nearby to permit the bombers to escape. The FBI said today it was a huge explosion and that the explosive used was most likely a simple combination of fertilizer and fuel oil.
The indictment charges that Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, former Army buddies with a grudge against the government, planned the bombing, selected the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City as their target, bought and stole materials for the bomb, and built...
The Oklahoma bombing was a major event in the 90s that essentially connected to there was a thread of truly far-right radicals. So a lot of times the word far-right these days is thrown around so glibly. It's like if a person is a center leftist, the media will now call them far-right. But these people were genuinely far-right. And they were connected to, there was a standoff at Ruby Ridge. There was also the Waco David Koresh compound that was set ablaze in a very controversial scene with the federal government and this cult. And in response to both of those things came the Oklahoma bombing. And it was right around the time to almost commemorate the birth of a certain German figure from the middle of the 20th century, whom I've already mentioned. And it would not be the last thing done around April 20th in the 20th century as well. But a lot of people were now focused on this right-wing menace that seemed to be there. And that was a very big event to say, hey, don't forget about us. But it wasn't the only thing. There was kind of a hysteria of a thing called Y2K, year 2000 millennium, the millennial bug. Let's watch a little material about this. Maybe you've heard about it. It rapidly vanished when the numbers all clicked to 2000. But it was a big deal. Why was it a big deal? Let's watch some material on it.
While it was known by various names like century date change and faulty date logic, the most popular terminology would emerge in 1995, Y2K, which stood for year 2000, K being the metric prefix. The next year, a few news stations covered the potential results of the bug, and by 1998 the US government had officially responded. First with the year 2000 Information and Readiness Disclosure Act, which encouraged companies to freely share information regarding the Y2K bug by offering them legal protections for those statements potentially being misleading. Shortly after, then-President Bill Clinton appointed John Koskinen to lead the President's Council on Year 2000 Conversion, which along with FEMA attempted to coordinate Y2K compliance efforts across all government offices and industry.
Yeah, people went nuts buying stuff. Almost like 2020. And what's interesting is that, there was a real fear that the numbers were all going to switch over and all the computers would die, which would create chaos. There were a few things that broke, but basically not much at all happened. Now, I was living in Alaska at the time in a small town, Haines, and nobody there worried about it. And I'll tell you why. It's because we were off of, we weren't that hooked up to computers and such yet. We knew we had diesel power to run our electricity. We knew that everyone had about 3 to 6 months worth of food in their freezers, lots of salmon, and people would share. So what's to worry about? We were 1,000 miles from Seattle. There wasn't much to worry about. So for me, it just came and went. I said, I wonder how they're doing out there in the world. And it was like, wow, pretty cool. Nevertheless, it seemed like a big deal at the time.
Todd and his family are preparing for the downside of Y2K should it come to pass.
There's people out there that I've talked to that said, there's nothing going to happen. What are you basing that on? Nobody knows. No one. Chicken noodle.
They've stocked their shelves with soups.
Chicken noodle.
More than you'd find in some convenience stores.
Somebody really liked chicken noodle.
From soup to meat, their freezer is nearly overflowing.
Let's see, we got your Y2K beef tenderloin.
There's also dry goods and canned fruit, batteries, generators, and medicine. It's no longer a basement. It has the look and feel of a general store.
We're average, everyday folk that, are a little concerned, and we're not going to depend on somebody else to take care of us if something does happen.
But for all this talk of the Y2K computer bug, Todd is not buying into that.
I don't know that it's necessarily going to be a computer problem. I think it's going to be a social and people problem.
1999 also brought another very important event. An event which, at the time, seemed to forecast the kind of political disruptions we would see going into the 21st century. And then after September 11th, this event was nearly forgotten. And now when we look back at it after the events of 2020, we can see that this event was indeed forecasting the 21st century. However, what's interesting about it is not how similar it is to the current day issues, but how different it is. And what I'm talking about is the WTO protests in Seattle in 1999. I'm going to start this off with Noam Chomsky talking about the World Trade Organization, the WTO. And it's very important that it's Noam Chomsky discussing it, because most of these people, whether they know it or not directly, are influenced by Noam Chomsky's views on the World Trade Organization. He has been tremendously influential to people's political thinking throughout the 90s.
The World Trade Organization replaces an earlier organization, GATT. The World Trade Organization came into being through several rounds of negotiations. The Uruguay round was the one that founded it. And it's an organization of states in theory and practice. It's an organization run by the richer and more powerful states and the multinational corporations that are closely linked to them.
So as we consider what was called the Battle for Seattle, although I guess they won because Seattle became this ultra politically correct place. But what's interesting is not, it's interesting on two levels. One, how similar this looks on some level to the protests we've seen this year turning into riots. And two, how different they are. For one thing, unions and old school leftists and environmentalists were all a part of these demonstrations. Now, the environmentalists, I'm sure we're going to see a lot more of in the 21st century. But what's interesting is the unions and people related to just regular trades who are protesting globalization through the World Trade Organization. Now, what's interesting is that is no longer, the traditional leftist concern with the working class is no longer a feature of the left in America or through many places in the Western world. Instead, the racial, gender, oppressed ideologies, what we now call the woke ideologies, for lack of a better word, are all dominant. And the gender issues are minimal, but present here at the World Trade Organization. What's also missing, though, there's no serious black racial issues being brought to the fore, which would certainly happen now. The police definitely seem to be overreacting, but what we see is that this sets up a kind of tension. I was expecting, personally, when I was witnessing, I didn't witness these live in any means, but just through the radio and television sources. When I heard of these things in 1999, I was expecting this to become more of a feature, these kinds of protests to be more of a feature of the 21st century, and then they didn't after September 11th. However, in the year 2000, there were more of these protests in Europe, which helped to create the Black Bloc and many of the tactics used on the streets now. We'll leave it there with some more documentary material on the protests in Seattle in 1999.
Well, the question you asked me, do I think that we have power? I mean, that's a really great question, and I think we do have power. I mean, I think when people get together like this, it's powerful because it will bring attention. It has to be covered. It has to be looked at. And just that word will spawn conversation. If no one came out for this and said, hell, you know, those guys know what's best, let them do their thing, and just read the nightly news or sat down in front of TV and watched it that way, then I don't think there'd be nearly as much questioning. You know, there wouldn't be nearly as much meat for conversation. So in that way, I do think there is power in the people.
No more violence! No more violence! Don't let anyone! No more violence! No more violence!
The police began to spray tear gas into the crowd and shot rubber bullets indiscriminately into the crowd.
This is an overkill. They could have had these guys standing way back around the corner, had regular officers out here. This is like almost we dare you to act.
But what was another big deal in 1999 was the Columbine massacre. There were a couple of guys, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, who walked into the Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado. And it wasn't pretty. And I'm going to spend a few moments with this, and I have a reason for it. And I will tell you at the end what that reason is, because I think this really relates to the present and not in the way most people think it does. But let's watch some documentary material, both from the time and from more recently, reminiscence of the adults who were kids back then.
Columbine High School, home to 1,800 students in Littleton, Colorado. Shortly before noon Denver time today, at least 2 young men dressed in black trench coats enter the school and randomly open fire. The scene 5 hours later is still a great deal of confusion. We wanted to hear now from Jeff Stone, who's with the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department.
Unfortunately, when we did make entry into the library, it was a pretty gruesome sight.
The gruesome scene included 2 young men who they believe were the suspects in the shooting who were found dead. Let's go now to NBC's Dan Abrams, who begins our coverage live tonight from Littleton. Dan?
Well, Tom, only moments ago, the police department confirmed there are fatalities, and 2 of the fatalities are 2 of the suspects. But this isn't over. There are still students and faculty members inside, and at least 1 suspect at large. And it all started with just another school day. A mild spring morning, just after 11 a.m., almost lunchtime, when the rampage began. Masked gunmen in trench coats start shooting into the school's cafeteria.
There was gunshots, and we all got down, and we crawled out, and we all ran just across the street.
Kids scatter. Shots ring off lockers and walls. Students are hit.
He shot a girl outside, and then he came into the cafeteria, and you could hear, like, bombs and shotguns going off. And then he came into the library and shot everybody around me. Then put a gun to my head and said, asked if we all wanted to die.
We walked out and we heard fireworks, and then we saw the guy with the gun, and I convinced myself that it was paintball, it was a senior prank, and he started spraying the ground in front of us, and you could kind of hear it and see it, and Dan went down, and I felt like a sharp pain in my foot. And then seconds later, maybe at the same time, my knee felt like it went out. And then this knee got hurt, and then it felt like somebody punched me in the chest.
I heard these popping noises coming from outside the school. They started to get louder. And then this teacher ran into the room. She was completely frantic. She ran over to the phone to call the police, and while she was on the phone, she kept yelling at all of us to hide and get underneath the tables. So I got underneath the table with my friend Matt. My friend Isaiah was walking by. I called out his name and he came over and sat next to me. I realized at that point that something serious was happening. The library was the first room the shooters came into. They were shooting off their guns immediately. They were mocking students before they shot or killed them, and they treated it like it was a game. They came over to where I was, and they shot and killed Isaiah, and then they shot and killed Matt.
Through our front door, another teacher kind of came in, and his face was completely white. And he didn't really have words. He just kind of stood there looking blank and didn't really know what to say. That immediately got everyone really concerned. He told us that we needed to get out or get down. And putting two and two together, the noise from the hallway and then the abundant screaming that we heard coming down the halls, his face and him telling us to either get down or get out was enough for the teacher to have us just move into like a secondary, kind of like an interior room, and he made us all get down. From there, instinct kind of kicked in. I knew that I shouldn't be getting down, I should be getting out. So I made the decision to get up from this. I was laying flat on the floor with classmates everywhere. Everyone's in a panic mode. They're crying, they're screaming, they're just freaked out. I stood up and opened that secondary classroom's door, and there's kids running through the hall. There's also a noise that we didn't identify at the time. We can hear glass shattering at that same time. It's the glass from the office the windows are just breaking. From that front main, it was all encased in glass, the doors and the windows. And we're seeing the bullets kind of buzz by randomly. Kids are running and screaming. And I knew I had to run.
So he shot me 4 times and I blacked out and then woke up sensing that somebody was behind me and I could see their shadow. And I put my hand up to ask for help. Just figured it was paintball, it hit a nerve, whatever. And he said, "Sure, I'll help you." And I looked up a little bit and he didn't grab my hand. And so I just laid back down and he put the shotgun right behind my ear and pulled the trigger. So I'm clearly in shock. I mean, I've almost completely bled out. The shot in my leg severed my femoral artery.
So I remember saying the Our Father when I heard the gunshots coming in through the library and the glass being shattered around. I remember when they were getting closer to our table that I just kept praying harder and harder and looking around under the table and just, I mean, it was this mixture of like unbelief and like fear and is this really like occurring right now? And I remember Val running from the table and I was like, oh my gosh, what is she doing right now? I don't know what's happening right now.
I remember running through hallways. I felt like my feet were really, really heavy. I ran track in high school, but I felt like I was just moving in slow motion. I'm just running literally to the parking lot. I ended up going to the parking lot and going onto Bowles Avenue. Mm-hmm. I literally ran smack dab into a green car. I bruised my face, but I smacked into the car and looked up and it was actually my mom's car. My mom was at home and heard what happened. She was on her way to the school. And just by the grace of God, I ended up running right into her car specifically. She got out in the middle of the street, got me, just threw me into the car.
And after they were done with our table, and I felt myself, and I was like, I think I'm okay. I think I'm all right. And I remember just sitting there like, what am I supposed to do now? What do I do? I'm looking at my friends. Lauren's not waking up. I'm seeing what everyone else is doing, and everyone seems like they're not moving, they're not waking up. And
so I kind of hear chaos, and I wake up again, and I see somebody run past me, and they go and check on Dan, and Dan had died at that time. And I'm thinking to myself, the last time I asked for help, nobody helped me. Well, screw it, I'll do it again. So I put up my hand, and it was Monty Fleming, paramedic, and he just picked me up, and I kept telling him, put me down, I'm fine. And he was running and carrying me and just hucked me in the back of the ambulance. It was somewhere around 35 surgeries, I think, maybe a few more or less, I don't know. But now, I mean, physically I'm fine. From day one of the hospital, it was just about, progress, like what's the next thing that I need to do to get out of the hospital.
In those weeks and months, and I think the biggest aspect of it was just the love and support from the community.
Patrick Ireland was 17 when he was shot. He became known as the boy in the window. It took him 3 hours to get there. He crawled past dead classmates, despite gunshot wounds to his head and leg that left him partially paralyzed.
There were a number of times where I was just, passing in and out of consciousness and wondering, what was going to happen next if the gunman would come back in.
One by one, students returned to Columbine High and left bouquets of flowers in a park half a mile away.
A little bit of pain, a little bit of everything at once. It's deep, but just got to be strong.
Parents, hug your kids. Pray that, be happy that you're with them. Kids, grab your friends, hold them tight, and never be mad at people, because it could happen in a second that they'll be gone. People are getting shot all around me.
There was a guy at a table right next to me and her, and they just shot him and then walked away, and then he was just sitting there in a pool of blood.
Detectives now believe they entered the school through a back door and stormed down the hallways. They cornered students in the cafeteria and the library, where there was nowhere to run. Witnesses say they laughed as they fired their weapons, executing their classmates who begged for their lives.
They were shooting anyone of color wearing a white hat or played a sport, and they didn't care who it was, and it was all at close range.
Screaming after they'd shoot up something, they'd go, woo! Just a pleasure for them.
This morning, students packed a prayer service at a local church and stood in the parking lot, embraced one another, and wiped away their tears. Graduation was less than 2 weeks away. Amber Burgess is Columbine High School's homecoming queen.
I don't even know if people are going to be able to walk back in the school again and see empty chairs, and it'll be horrible.
She was full of life, and anything that she did, she was determined to do and go wherever she wanted to. And she just was full of drive and passion and life.
I essentially told her that her soul touched us all in a way that words cannot begin to describe, and that we were going to miss her more than any of us could ever begin to say, and that I loved her.
We got a call from the Today Show, and they said, we'd like to have you on with Isaiah's dad. And I wanted to give Isaiah's dad a hug.
Thank you so much for being here. We are so terribly sorry about your son.
Okay. It was 2 mornings later, after the shooting on April 22nd. The camera lights were out, and it was pouring snow.
Craig, how are you doing this morning?
It's hard.
You were in the library with Isaiah and another good friend.
I started to share about what had happened to me, and I shared about Isaiah's last moments.
They said there's a N-word over here. And Isaiah tried to back up, and they shot Isaiah.
He's crying, hearing about the last moments of his son. He's holding my hand. And then I start to talk about Rachel, and I started to cry.
All these people that I was praying for, their brothers and sisters were showing up.
But not your sister.
It was the first time I started to talk about my sister on camera.
Some of your sister's friends I know have turned her car into a memorial.
She was set apart from her school in a way. I thought she was more grown up.
I had no idea that would be something that I would be doing 1,000 more times over the next 20 years.
Columbine was a huge deal. It was a huge deal for many reasons. It related to the right-wing stuff like the Oklahoma bombing. But it also related, for instance, to Marilyn Manson. They listened to his music. And his, we love hate, we hate love. These guys were, in a sense, now, I don't think Marilyn Manson's music made them do anything, and he fought against that. But nevertheless, he was, as often happens, he was demonized. His career never quite was the same after that. But, when we look back at Columbine now, there's a tendency for two different reactions. On the left, it's like, oh my God, guns in America. We really have to do something. And look how many times it's happened since then. And on the other side, these are mentally ill people. And we really have to do something about mental illness and learn to see when students are having problems. And you know what? I look at that and I say, folks, wake up. This isn't about either of those things. This is about the loss of meaning. That none of these kids have anything to live for. That, look at the music they're listening to. Look at the movies they're watching. They have been stripped of any bedrock of culture. By the late 1990s, what was considered culture for someone in high school was not the great works of literature, not the great paintings, not the works of the Renaissance or the Dutch masters. No one thought, we need to listen to symphony orchestras. We need to understand all this. No, that was all gone by then. I remember the attitude. And it was just as true in Haines, Alaska, when I arrived there in 1996, as it was back in New York City. If anything, it was worse in Haines, Alaska, because the kids being pickled in MTV, and in fact, they got all of their musical thoughts from MTV. And I tried to tell them, why don't you listen to the radio? I'm going to play you some other stuff. And some of them would do it and would get it, but most of them, they were listening to, they were just watching MTV and getting all their cues from there. Which is to say, they were getting all their cues from exactly the places that wanted to sell them music and didn't really care about them in any actual moral sense. So, whether it's Eminem or Insane Clown Posse or Marilyn Manson or Offspring, Pretty Fly for a White Guy, or No Doubt, I'm Just a Girl, or Cherry Poppin' Daddies, or Green Day, none of these people actually provided anything of meaning, except for the meaning that comes basically from music anyway. And, were kids during that time going to find meaning in a rave? No. Not that kind of meaning. They could have fun. Fun became the order of the day. Cute became the order of the day. Cool became the order of the day. And cool means showing no emotions. So, there was a sense of death to everything. And it was a commercial sense of death. It was teen movies where you just had fun watching kids getting sliced up in a kind of a postmodern package. And I like those movies. I like Scream. The Scream movies, I think, are pretty good. Nevertheless, there's no context anymore. It's like I've seen YouTube videos by people who think that great horror movies started in the year 2000. And if you try to tell them, yeah, but what about Rosemary's Baby or what about Frankenstein, all these things from the past, they don't even know what you're talking about anymore. And that's kids who are like millennial generation. If you're younger, do you really have any connection with the past? If I say Shakespeare, what does that mean to you? If I say Beethoven, what does that mean to you? If you are Gen Z or less, I suppose there's young children who are less than Gen Z. You know, it's like everything's been stripped away. So I don't find it hard to understand why kids go nuts. It's because they have nothing to live for. It isn't about having too many guns, although that's an issue. And it isn't about mental illness, although that's an issue. Why do you think they're going nuts? It's because our society provides nothing for them. And I think there are people now who are beginning to understand that. But we'll get there. Just to show you how little meaning there was at the second half of the 20th century, at the second half of the 90s, I'm going to play just the words of a couple of pop songs, and I just want you to look at them. So the first one, this is from Alanis Morissette's #1 hit, You Ought to Know. I just want you to read the words.
Did you forget about me, Mr. Duplicity? I hate to bug you in the middle of dinner. There was a slap in the face, how quickly I was replaced. And are you thinking of me when you fuck her? 'Cause the love that you gave every night was a way, but I ain't got enough for you to be open wide. No. And every time you speak her name, does she know how you told me and hold me until you died? Till you died, but you're still alive. And I'm here to remind you of the mess you left when you went away. It's not fair to deny me of the cross I bear that you gave to me. You ought to know.
That is a pop song. I don't mean it's a rock song. I mean it's a pop song made by a pop industry. And look at the lyrics on that. Not only is she swearing very openly, and not only is her attitude one of complete and utter cynicism, but she hopes the guy dies. That's where we've come to. That's a pop song. Here's another one. Natalie Imbruglia singing Torn. Again, cheap pop song.
There's nothing where he used to lie. My inspiration has run dry. That's what's going on. Nothing's right, I'm torn. I'm all out of faith. This is how I feel. I'm cold and I am shamed, lying naked on the floor. Illusion never changed into something real. I'm wide awake and I can see the perfect sky is torn. I'm all out of faith. This is how I feel. I'm cold and I'm ashamed, bound and broken on the floor. You're a little late. I'm already torn.
I'm bound and lying naked on the floor. Has there ever been a pop song? I mean, she's singing this sweet, airy voice. It's just like, I'm bound and lying naked on the floor. Has there ever been a pop song before that? I think that was like 98 or so. That had such dark, horrifying lyrics. Bound and lying naked on the floor. It's like someone has invaded your house and tied you to the radiator or something. And you're naked and you've been violated. You see, that's a sweet pop song by the late 1990s. You know, they used to have, you know, this is in line with How Much Is That Doggy in the Window. It's not in line with the Beatles and rock and roll and heavy metal. It's with the cheap pop entertainment music. Do you see what I'm saying about the noise is everywhere now? Let's end this with a couple of songs. There were bands that continued to make music after the noisy part of the beginning of the 90s. But it was very hard for them to make music that was as aggressive as Nirvana or Soundgarden or Helmet or Nine Inch Nails or all of that stuff. All of that just seemed, and in fact that seemed too commercial because of what had happened with pop punk music and Marilyn Manson. So instead they made what at the time was called indie lo-fi music, or indie lo-fi noise of various degrees. And the point was, it wasn't supposed to be recorded perfectly, and not all of this stuff fits that category, but it's one of the styles. I'm going to play you a little bit of Neutral Milk Hotel. The lead singer is Jeff Mangum, and this is from a live performance, and they play with a musical saw. As far as people creating music, these guys are great. And interestingly enough, two of what I consider to be the most stellar albums of the second half of the 90s, which was Neutral Milk's Hotel and The Airplane Over the Sea and Cattell Koenig's Jet. They don't... Neutral Milk shows up sometimes on people's lists of great albums, but Cattell Koenig, people don't even remember her. She was great. But let's listen to Neutral Milk Hotel. And listen to the kind of anguish in his voice, but it's not the same kind of, it's not that fighting anguish anymore. It's almost a resignation. Neutral Milk Hotel. And their album Airplane Over the Sea is absolutely incredible. I find it amazing. But it's got this sorrow. It's noisy. It's got this sorrow to the whole thing. It's, again, it can't fight anymore. There's no fighting left. There's no rebellion left. And right now what we're listening to underneath as I'm talking is a group called Low, which is a pretty good name for the group since most of their music was very quiet and low. And while it was quiet, it was still noisy, which is very interesting. They would just sometimes, this song is, Do You Know How to Waltz is the name of the song. And of course there's no waltzing going on in the song. And it's about an 11-minute song with a 6 or 7 minute section of just drifting, floating noise. Groups like Sigur Rós would do this, and from Iceland, and other people would do what's called beautiful noise. And I am going to play you a little bit of Cattell Koenig's music, because again, she has a lot of the same kind of Fin De Siécle sort of exhaustion, really. There's a really beautiful song called There You Go. And this is near the end of the song. She's singing live. It's actually from 2002, but this song is from 1998 originally. And it contains this moment. But what's interesting is she's talking about a lover just going away and letting this lover go. And in the end, you realize she's singing as if she is Orpheus from the old Greek myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, but you can almost see it taking place on the streets of Paris or something like that. It's a beautiful song, and again, it has that sense of just winding things down.
There you go now. There you go now. There you go. There you go. Down the boulevard, the avenue, the rail track, the runway, the white lines, those white lines. I don't know why I did it, but I did. I don't know why I did it, but I did. Now I must return to the underworld. I turn. Swinging down the boulevard, a miracle, that's what you are. I was a free man.
Ketelkennek from the album Jet, the original song of that, which I highly recommend looking for. Portishead. We're going to play a little bit from there. This is from what was called the trip-hop scene or movement, style, genre, whatever. What's interesting is that this was another dark style from the end of the Millennium. Based on dub reggae, a little bit of funk, a little bit of progressive rock. And I remember playing this in Alaska, these albums, because I had arrived there and for whatever reason, they had stopped getting music around the year 1990, so it was up to me to get the music into the... they had missed an awful lot by 1996, and so when I brought in the Portishead and Massive Attack CDs and such, I started getting complaints from people saying, what is this? I remember one guy, I went to a community board meeting for the radio station and said, what is this space funeral gothic music that Bird is playing? Eventually people caught up, but it was kind of funny. Let's listen to Portishead.
We suffer every day. What is it for? These crowns of illusion are fooling us all. And now I am weary and I feel like I do. It's only you who can tear me apart. And it's only you who can turn my wooden heart. The size of our fight, it's just a dream.
And finally, just to kind of give you this end of the Millennium feel, we're going to go out with a bit of techno music in the kind of more ambient style, which was like more for chilling to rather than dancing to. And this is Richie Houghton, who goes under the name at that time. Now he plays under his own name. It's kind of funny here in Georgia. He was supposed to play here. And then the virus came. I don't know if he actually did or not. But the poster was up for a long time on the streets. But he went under the name Plastic Man. And this is from an album. The name of this piece is Contained. Or I think that's the name of the album. And this one might be just called Consume or something like that. Anyway, let's listen to Plastic Man. It's this dark, brooding thing. And I think that kind of sums up for me how the 20th century ended. It did not end with the bang. It didn't end with the Y2K year 2000 apocalypse. We got the year 2000 apocalypse in 2020. But instead, well, just feel this thing. So finally, the end of the final pattern, as I described it in art, is that the apocalyptic noise goes into everything, finally, through the internet. The computer is the big breakthrough, the home computer, the personal computer, PC, the Apple computer, the Mac, but also the computers used for raves, what would eventually be the Nintendos and the PlayStations, for the Xboxes for video games, digital projection for movies. Downloading. Napster was coming up here. People would just start downloading and streaming rather than buying things if they could help it. Although the big corporations are looking for ways to make sure they'd much rather have you stream than download. But no, the noise went into everything, and now we're living in the society of noise. And when I say noise, I don't simply mean aural noise. I also mean visual noise, informational noise, political noise, propaganda noise, moral noise, personal noise. People, I would say today, are completely exhausted. Many people think we're living at the end of times. Many people think we're living in the most nightmarish time. Well, it isn't because this is any more nightmarish than World War II. 70 million people died in World War II. About 20 or 30 million people died in the Soviet Union. Yeah, this isn't that bad at all. But it's what's going on in our heads, which we're going to come to in the next couple of episodes of how we got here. But let's end with just a little bit of that year 2000 New Year's from Times Square in New York City.
He invoked the words of Martin Luther King Jr. when he said, "Let freedom ring," and this is what it looked like. said earlier that this was a subdued crowd in Washington, but it doesn't look like it at the moment. And what wonders they have wrought inside the monument.
So that's the end of the millennium. Or is it? Find out next time when we talk about the aughts. And things are coming this way. Things are going to change. There'll be some airplanes coming this way that are going to change everything. But we'll talk about that next time. This is Byrne. Thanks for listening. I appreciate the fact that you've spent, I don't know how many hours this is going to be by the time you watch this, but I appreciate it. And you should subscribe. You should hit like. If you want to know when I'm actually releasing things, hit the bell icon. If you don't hit it, you won't get a notification on your computer. Or maybe you want that and don't want to be interrupted. Fine by me. And you could contribute. And there is a PayPal link below, and I can certainly use it. But, you know, this is a weird year, and you might be super tight for money, so don't worry about it. Meanwhile, remember, Anadromist is what salmon do. They swim against the stream to get home. You should do that yourself.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.
Yeah, baby! Yeah.
Goodbye.